Hello everyone, welcome back to this hands-on demo. Previously, we've looked into how to deploy our application using Docker Compose locally on our local machine. In this demo, we're going to be taking it one step further by deploying this application to the cloud. We're going to be using EC2 instance to host our microservice applications, and also we're still going to be using Docker Compose for the deployment. However, we're going to be making a slight change. Now, what we're going to be doing is that we're going to be automating the entire process. So instead of us manually building our image, like running Docker Compose, Docker pull, and all of that, we're going to be using GitHub Actions to automate the entire process. So this is the three key technologies that we're going to be using. So this is how it's going to work. When we make any changes to our code, GitHub Actions is going to pick up that changes. It's going to build our Docker image. It's going to upload it to a registry, and then it's not going to run it. It's not going to deploy that new changes to our application running inside an EC2 instance. So these are the steps that we need to take in order for us to get this app, our application up and running. So these are the various steps, and the steps here are not ordered. Now, first of all, we need to create and configure an EC2 instance. Now, once we create our EC2 instance, we also need to install some software inside our EC2 instance. Obviously, we are going to be running containers, and if you are running containers, you need to install a container runtime on those servers. So we're going to be using Docker, which is what we have been using right from the start. So we need to install Docker as the required software, and also we also need the private key for that particular EC2 instance, which is our server. Because when we want to deploy to a server, the GitHub Action pipeline need access to that server. So the only way for us to grant access to that server is by, giving the GitHub Actions pipeline the access, which is the SSH private key that it needs to connect to the server. And also, we're also going to create a security group. Now, if you are trying to connect to a server on AWS EC2 instance precisely, you need to specify some firewall rules. Now, the default one that comes in is port 22, but we also need to access our application. So we also need to expose those ports that our applications are running in. We're going to see that shortly on the Docker Compose file. So we're going to expose that as well. Then after that, we now need to create a registry where our images will be pushed to. So we're going to be using two options. We're going to be using Docker Hub, and also we're going to be using Amazon EC Arrow. I will show you how we can use both in this lecture. And also, we're also going to store our credits on our GitHub Actions. Now remember that GitHub Actions also need access to our repository, because when pulling from a private repository, you need to authenticate to that repository in order for you to pull those images from those repository. And lastly, we're now going to write our GitHub workflow. Now in GitHub Actions, just like in every other CI/CD tool, we need a specific configuration that we tell the CI/CD tool on how to run our pipeline. So this is how the pipeline is going to look like. So we have a first step in the pipeline that's going to build our Docker image. The second one is now going to push our image to registry. The third step is now going to connect to the EC2 instance, and the last step is now going to run our Docker Compose file, which we spin up our containers, which will be running our application. So this is how the project is going to look like. It's an exciting project, and you're going to learn a lot from this project. Now, without wasting much of your time, let's jump straight into the implementation. But before that, if you haven't subscribed to my YouTube channel, please subscribe, like, and also comment what you've learned in this video. And most importantly, share to those who need this video. This is how you can give back to me, because it's not easy putting out this video out there. And a little thing like liking and and following me, goes a long way for me. It motivates me to keep creating more educational content for DevOps professionals and enthusiasts like you. So without wasting much of your time, let's jump straight into the demo. So this is where we stopped in our previous video, and this is our Docker Compose file that runs our microservices. And just to recap, we have the voting service. This is the voting service that deploys the front end for voting. And also we've got the result application that displays the result to users or people who wants to vote. And also we also have the worker container that does some processing under the hood. And also we've got Redis, an in-memory database, which is used for caching and also for queuing requests from the front-end applications. And we've got our database, which is Docker. Now, these are the various microservices that we need in order for us to get this application up and running. Like I said in this video, we're going to be automating all the entire process from building and pushing our application to a Docker registry or to, ECR. So this is how the project currently looks like. So now let's create our CI/CD pipelines. But before then, let's create our EC2 instance and also configure our application. So let's jump straight into it. So I am here on my EC2 instance console, and I'm going to launch an EC2 instance. So first of all, come here and click on instances, and then click on launch instance. I'm going to call this web server, which is going to host our application. Scroll down. We're going to be using Ubuntu, so click on Ubuntu for this demo. And let's go for our AMI. So we're going to leave it T3 micro. This is because this is free tier eligible, and you don't want to choose an AMI that will cost you some money. So let's stick with T3 micro unless we have a specific need of why we don't want to use that. But for now, let's use EC2 instance T3 micro. And also our login pair, we're going to use a specific login key. So if you don't have any key pair available on your machine, you can create a new one. But with me, for me, I already have some SSH keys here, so I'm going to use this one, test. But ensure that you create a new one, or you can use the one that you have locally on your machine if you have one. So let's scroll down. So for the network settings, we're going to create our own security group. And the default one that comes is allow SSH traffic from anywhere. We're going to leave this as default, but then let's edit some stuff. So let's come here. Let's call our security group web server. Let's call it web server SG. And let's just copy that. Let's copy that and paste it here. The same thing. And let's leave this like this, although we're going to make some changes, but let's just leave it like this. Remember I told you that we'll be exposing a port on the server where our front end, like the voting service and the result service, will be running on. So if we don't expose it, user can access our application. So we need to expose that. But let's just leave it like this. When we get there, we're going to sort it out. So let's scroll down and click launch instance. Right, great. Now we've successfully launched our EC2 instance. If you come here like this, you're going to see that the EC2 instance is up and running. So let's come to our instance summary. Click on here. Now we need some EC2 instance creds in order for us to be able to deploy from our GitHub Actions. Now let's scroll down. What we are going to be needing we need the public IP of this EC2 instance, and we also need the username. Now the default username that comes with Ubuntu when you create an EC2 instance with Ubuntu, this is the default username. So we need this username and the IP address. Of course, when you want to log into a server, you need the username and the IP address. And make sure that you also have the private key, because without the private key, it's not going to allow you to log in. So we also need the private key. That is what I have. Look, I already have my private key locally. So this is how to set it up. We're done with this. Now let's move ahead. Now, in order for us to move ahead, we also need a GitHub account. Now, remember that it is a GitHub Actions CI/CD pipeline. So we also need to push our project to a repository. Now, if you come here, if you come back to our application, if you come here and let's check something. Let's check our terminal. If you come here like this and let's see, let's run ls ile and let's see which particular repository is configured on this project. Now remember that we cloned this project from a public repository by Docker. Now let's see who and where the project is being cloned from. So let's see cat.git/ /config. This is now going to check the configuration for this repository or for this project. So let's see. As you can see, we cloned this from Docker samples example voting application. And you know that we don't have access to this repository, so we want to be able to deploy it to, or we want to be able to push it to our own GitHub account. Now we're going to change this, and in order for us to do this, we now need to create a project on our GitHub account where we can now push this application to and also utilize the GitHub Actions. So let's jump straight into it. So let's come back to our browser and let's create a new project. So click on new. Now you can call this project whatever you want. So I'm just going to call it voting application. Let me call it voting app, and we're going to leave it public and leave the add-readme file. Leave this. Let's just leave it like that. Or let's say we are building. Obviously, we are building like a lot of applications, so it's like a microservice application. So it's very difficult for us to find any .ignore template that's going to match what we want. So let's just leave it like that. Now let's click on create repository. Now we've created our repository, and we now need to configure our local repository to be able to, push our changes to this repository. Now, if you see here, there are two ways you can do this. Now, you can actually create this you can create new repository in the command line, but we don't want to do this. Now, we want to be able to push an existing repository from the command line. So this is what we are going to be using. So let's go back to our repository. Let's come here. So let's clear our screen. And let's remove the current one. Git remove. Let's run git remove origin and hit enter. So what that's going to do is going to remove the origin, which is the Docker example repo that we cloned this project from. Obviously, we don't want to push there, so we're going to remove it. And now we're not going to add our own repository, which is the one we have access to, which is our private GitHub account. So we're not going to add that to it. Now let's come back to where we came from. So let's copy this. Let's copy git remote add origin. This is what we need. And go back and paste it. Okay. And we also need to set it up. So we also need to set it up. Let's hit like this. Okay, that's good. Now we've set this up, and we can now push this project to our remote repository. So let's do that. Let's do git add dot. Now this is now going to add everything here. And also let's say git commit. This is going to be our first commit. So let's call it first commit. You know, in the real world, you're using more useful and intuitive, like more useful git commit. So let's hit enter. So everything has been committed. Now let's push. Let's see if we're going to have any issue. Now, if you are pushing for the very first time when you set a new origin, you need to run this command first. Okay, great. So we now have our application. We now have our source code pushed to GitHub. Now let's go back and see if that is there. Now let's refresh. Yeah, we now have our application in the Git repository. Now there are quite a few things that we actually need to do. We need to clean up this README file. We don't want it. We want to have our own README file. As some of us will be using this as a project on our portfolio, so we'll get rid of that. But let's just leave it like that. You know, let's just leave it like that. Now let's go back to this. Now remember I told you the guys that we'll be needing the IP address, and also we need the IP address, and also we're going to be exposing some port on our server, right? Okay, so let's now create our GitHub Action CI/CD pipeline. Now, in order for us to do that, you now need to create a folder here. So if you come here at this top level, let's create a folder. Let's call it .github. Let's hit enter. Sorry, it's not a file. It should be a project. So let's delete that. My bad. So it's going to be a folder. Let's call it github.github. It's called .github. Now let's hit enter. Now this folder is what is going to be housing our GitHub Action CI/CD configuration files. So inside this folder, we now need to create another subfolder called workflows. It's called workflows, right? It's called workflows. Let's hit enter. Now, all our workflows, which is like our CI/CD pipeline, will be inside this workflow. You get what I mean? It's going to be inside this workflow. Now, inside the workflow, let's now create our configuration file. Let's call this one build. Let's call it build.yaml. Now, this build.yaml is the CI/CD pipeline or the CI/CD workflow that is going to be building our application and also pushing it to repository. And if possible, we can also use this to deploy to our EC2 instance, right? So this is how our configuration is going to look like. Now, let me go over it one more time. So we want to write a CI/CD pipeline using GitHub Actions that is going to run and deploy our application. Now, remember that previously, if you watch my previous video, we ran Docker Compose manually on our terminal, but now we don't want to do that. We want to deploy our application to an EC2 instance, and we want to be able to, connect it and automating all the processes using these GitHub Actions. And in order for you to create a GitHub Action workflow, you need this folder. It's called .github, and within that folder, you need workflow. Now, inside that workflow, that is where you now place your CI/CD YAML template, and that. So this is how it looks like. So now let's write our CI/CD pipeline template. Now, before then, I want to point you to the official documentation. If you are new to GitHub Actions, if this is your first time using it, then you might want to check out the official GitHub Actions documentation in order for you to understand some concept. But I'll be going through it, and if you feel lost, you don't understand anything, please go and check it out. So let's go back to this. Now, if you come to the search for workflow syntax for GitHub, you're going to see how the syntax looks like. So we need a name for that particular workflow. And also we need on. These are the special keyword I need you to focus on. So the name keyword is the name for the workflow. And this on is how we want that particular CI/CD pipeline to be triggered. So there are many ways you can do this. You can call it on push. What this means is that this pipeline will only be triggered when somebody pushes to the repository. So it can also be on push and fork. There are there are various ways you can actually do it, but we're going to be seeing some of them soon in this demo tutorial, right? So as I'm writing it, you can follow along, but if you need more information on how it works, you can come to the official repository for GitHub Actions, and then you can read more about it, and if possible, do more hands-on on it, right? So cool. Now, let's go back to our terminal. Now, on our IDE. Now, let's start with writing the CI/CD template. So first of all, we need a name, the name for this workflow, right? So let's call it a name. Let's call it deploy to, let's just call it production. Let's call it production, or let's just call it deploy to EC2, right? Now, how do we want to deploy this? What is going to trigger this pipeline? So that is what we now call the on. So if you come here, let's do on. Now, how do we want to do it? Is it when somebody pushes to the repository, or when somebody creates a merge request? Whatever trigger that you want, you can specify it. So, but in this case, we need push. So let's call it push. And when we call it push, how do we want it to be triggered? Is it when somebody pushes to the main branch, or somebody pushes to the staging branch? How do you want it to be configured? That is where branches now comes in. So you can now write branches and also main. Now, we need it to only be triggered when somebody pushes to the main branch, right? So when somebody pushes to the main branch, we want to trigger this pipeline. But when we're talking about the main branch, obviously we don't want anybody making changes to files that are not included in the application and wanting that pipeline to run. For instance, obviously we don't want the pipeline to run when somebody makes changes to the README file, right? We don't want that. So we're going to be specifying some specific part in the CI/CD pipeline that we want this workflow to be triggered when those changes are made. So those parts, that's what we're now going to include. So if you come here and search, type parts. Now these are the various parts that we want this pipeline to be triggered when somebody makes changes. So let's call it parts. And let's specify the parts that we want it to be triggered when somebody makes changes to those parts. So let's start with the first one. We want to trigger this pipeline when somebody makes changes to the result folder. Let's call it results, and everything inside the result folder. And secondly, we want to do the same for the voting application, because there are 3 microservices. And the third one for the worker. And also, we also want it to be triggered when somebody makes changes to the GitHub workflow, which is the one we currently are. If somebody makes changes to this workflow, it means that that person is trying to run some test. So we also want that. And also for the Docker Compose, we also want changes as well. If somebody makes changes to the Docker Compose, we also want to run the pipeline. And I think that's all for now. And just a recap, let's go through it again. Now, the first one is the name of the workflow. Now, what is a workflow? Workflow is, an execution, how you want your pipeline to run. It's called a workflow. And inside the workflow, we have some keywords. Now, we also have the on. Now, this on is not telling you that I want this workflow name deployed to EC2 instance to run only when these conditions are met. You understand? When these conditions are met. Now, what are the conditions? The first condition is push. I want this pipeline to run when there's a push. Now, we want it to run when there's a push, but on what kind of push we want it to run? Because obviously anybody can push to your repository, they can push to different branches, but we want it to be specific. Now we want this pipeline to run when somebody pushes to the what? To branch. Now what are the branch? What are the branch that we want this application, this pipeline to run? We want it to run when somebody pushes to the main branch, right? But remember that in the real world, you are not going to be pushing directly to the main branch. You're going to be pushing to some other branches, but this is like a demo. I want you to understand the concept. Now, we want it to run when somebody pushes to this branch. Now this is the branch, which we can see here. But then, we don't want this pipeline to run when changes are made to particular files that are irrelevant to us. Like the README file is just for documentation purpose. It's not going to store anything application. Maintenance is the same. And also, like the architectural diagram, if you don't want the application to run when there's this. So we now want to be specific with the path. So this first part is telling us that this pipeline is going to run when somebody pushes to the main branch on this path, which is the result path, which is this one. Now this contains our application source code. So obviously we want any changes here to be reflected there, right? Cool. The second one is the voting part. So the same thing, and also the worker part. And also we also want it to run when somebody touches the CI/CD pipeline workflow, or the CI/CD GitHub Action workflow template itself, which is this one. And also we also want it to run if somebody made changes to the Docker compose file, right? So those are the conditions that needs to be met, and let's jump straight to the main job. Now let's come here and type jobs. Now jobs is the main execution. Now this is where we now want our application, we now want to specify what kinds of job that we want to run. Now it's like a list, so it contains different jobs, just like the name suggests. So let's start with the first one. Now the first one is not going to be, let's call it deploy. Let's call it deploy. Now the deploy is the name of these jobs, and within a job we have different steps. Now you can call a job a related task that you want to run once, and all these related tasks will be running on the same virtual machine. Now, when you are running a pipeline, a GitHub Action pipeline, using, if you are running a GitHub Action pipeline, under the hood, the execution of that pipeline is being run on an environment. It can be a virtual machine, it can be a container, but with GitHub Action, it is running inside a virtual machine. So GitHub Actions or GitHub, under the hood, spin up some virtual machines, and inside that virtual machines, that is where you run your executions, and that is where you run your jobs. So we call it deploy, and let's go. Now we want it to run on a Linux machine, which is Ubuntu. So we're going to type Ubuntu. Let's call it the latest Ubuntu. So, and also we need, now this is where the application is going to be running, which is Ubuntu. And let's now add our steps. Let's add our steps. Now remember that steps are, the various steps for that particular job. Like instance, a job can be build image, and within the build image, you want to be able to tag the image, and also before you now build it and now upload to ECR or Docker Hub. Now let's go through one after the other. So the first step is, let's give it a name. Now we want to check out our code. Now in a GitHub Actions CI/CD pipeline, the first thing you need to do before running any other thing is to check out your code. Now checking out your code means like you are trying to clone the repository, you're trying to clone it and then going to the right branch before running any execution or command against it, right? So we're now going to type uses. Now we're going to use this. Now remember that this is a workflow. Normally we are supposed to write our own command for this workflow, But GitHub Actions is so much fun because you can use somebody else's workflow. Now, what this means is that somebody has a workflow that has already implemented this logic for us, like checking out our code. So because of that, we'll not need to write our own workflow from the scratch, which is time consuming and tedious. So we're going to be using that unless we need a specific use case where we need to have our own workflow. That is where we cannot write our workflow, right? So let's go hit enter and we'll check out our code. Now the next step will now be to, set up Docker. Now we need to set up Docker on the server in order for us to be able to build our application, right? We need to be able to we need to set up Docker. But then we also realize that we are not actually doing this on this machine, all right? We don't want to do this on this machine, on this virtual machine given to us by GitHub. We want to be running all these commands inside our virtual machine, like building our image and also deploying it.